Once upon a time, amidst the rugged landscapes of the American Southwest, there roamed a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of many. He was not a man of great stature, nor did he possess extraordinary powers, but his spirit was indomitable, his resolve unyielding. This man was none other than the legendary Apache chief Geronimo. Born in the harsh deserts of present-day Arizona, in the early 19th century, Geronimo's life was a testament to the tumultuous times in which he lived. From a young age, he learned the ways of his people, the Apache, steeped in traditions, honor, and an unwavering connection to the land they called home. But as the winds of change swept across the frontier, Geronimo found himself thrust into a world where the old ways clashed violently with the encroaching forces of civilization. The Apache lands were coveted by settlers and soldiers alike, and Geronimo soon became a thorn in their side, a symbol of resistance against the tide of progress. Born on June 16, 1829, and given the name Goyakla, meaning one who yawns. He was from the Badonkohe band, a relatively small subgroup of the Chiricahua Apache. War was all he knew. Even as a child, Goyakla had a bounty on his scalp, which was worth 25 pesos to the Mexican government. But that didn't end there. He would later become the bane of Mexico, and it's thought that the name Geronimo itself comes from the dying screams of Mexicans calling the name of Saint Germain as they died by his hand. Apache people of the Southwest were surrounded by colonial European invaders who wanted their land. They had to defend themselves from the Mexican army to the south and the U.S. Army to the north. Surrounded by enemies on all sides, although being a warrior since a child, his life took a drastic and heartbreaking turn after the end of the U.S.-Mexico War in 1848. Part of the agreement involved Mexico ceding much of the Apache nation's land to the United States. Then, in 1854, the United States used the Gadsden Purchase to pay Mexico $10 million for 29,670 square miles that would later become part of Arizona and New Mexico, pretty much the remainder of Chiricahua Apache territory. Just 4 years later, while he was away on a trading trip, Mexican soldiers led by Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco attacked Geronimo's band. They murdered dozens of Apache, including Geronimo's mother, wife, and 3 young children. In his autobiography, he wrote,
"I've lost everything."
Driven by anger, hatred, and bitter resentment to the colonizers, he would also become a bane to the U.S. settler too. Geronimo's followers also believed that he had spiritual powers, and it was during this life-changing tragedy that he received a remarkable vision. While he was holding a ceremony after the slaughter of this family, he says a voice told him, "No gun will ever kill you. I will guide your arrows." From that moment on, he devoted his life to avenging the brutal killings of his loved ones. He would not only be a warrior, but also a medicine man and spiritual advisor to his community. After the death of the Apache leader Cohis, who was a legendary name amongst the Chiricahua Apaches, his name would continue to grow and his infamy would spread. Over the next few decades, the U.S. government attempted to coax Geronimo and his followers onto reservations, but he and his people managed to break out of their confinement every time, and they could not capture him. He managed to outsmart them at every turn. The U.S. military and elected officials faced years of humiliation, as the news of his ability to evade them made headlines across the country. The natives who lacked the firepower, food and water supplies, and organization of the U.S. Army caused humiliation as the news made headlines across the country. It was Geronimo's ancestral knowledge of the terrain that was one of his greatest strengths. Somehow, with women and children in tow, he and his warriors were able to travel as much as 70 miles a day through the desert. With each passing year, Geronimo's legend grew. He was a master strategist, leading daring raids against his enemies with unmatched cunning and ferocity. His name became synonymous with defiance, his very presence striking fear into those who sought to subdue him. But for all his bravery and skill, Geronimo was not invincible. He endured countless battles, witnessing the suffering of his people as they were driven from their ancestral lands, forced to surrender to a fate they could not escape. It couldn't go on forever, though. On September 4th, 1886, Geronimo agreed to surrender on the condition that he and his people would eventually be able to return to their homelands. He was with 17 of his bravest warriors and a handful of women and children, including a white boy named James McKinn, who had been captured by the Apache but loved living with them so much that he cried when he was returned to his parents. But as you can expect, the U.S. government betrayed their promise. He would never see his home again. Instead of taking them to their homelands, him and his band were captured and taken to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. While in Florida, the government took their children away and placed them at Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania for re-education. A third of them died at the notoriously inhumane boarding school. The great warrior and defender of his people would be stripped of everything that had once defined him, and the U.S. government got their own back for all the embarrassment he'd caused them. They would make a public mockery of him, always keeping him under guard, and present him to the public as a living relic of his ancient ancestral people. He was allowed to take part in Wild West shows and World's Fairs, always under guard, where curious settlers could pay top dollar to gawk at the great Apache leader. Geronimo was even invited to participate in President Theodore Roosevelt's second inauguration. During a meeting with Roosevelt at the White House, he tried to plead his case. He asked the president to allow him and his followers to return to their ancestral lands.
Take the ropes from our hands,
Geronimo appealed, with tears in his eyes. Roosevelt responded by telling Geronimo,
"You've got a bad heart,"
and that he and his people were not good Indians. Needless to say, the president denied Geronimo's request. After this proud, difficult life, the passionate warrior, the final holdout, spent his last 22 years as a prisoner of war. He died of pneumonia on February 17, 1909, at Fort Sill, where he is buried in the Beef Creek Apache Cemetery. Geronimo's last words before dying were, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." He was probably right. With him alive, the U.S. government could never let their guard down. However, his life of battles and losses were not in vain. 4 years after his death, the government finally let the remainder of Geronimo's Chiricahua Apache followers leave Fort Sill. They were given the option to remain in Oklahoma or return to New Mexico and live on a reservation. Most returned to the West. His life of battles and losses were not in vain. Although seen as a savage, Goyakla, later known as Geronimo, slayer of many settlers, Mexican and American, was a man with a love for his family, homeland, and way of life that he was willing to risk everything to protect. His name, along with many other Native American warriors, will never be forgotten and will always be spoken about when the history of North America is told.